What the media isn't telling you about the true cost of these riots and protests around the country. That's coming up on today's Hot Zone.
This is the Hot Zone. Engaging with the news in a whole new way, international war correspondent Chuck Holton brings insight into areas of crisis and lets you help those affected.
Hey folks, Chuck Holton here. Thanks for being a part of the Hot Zone. I want to talk a little bit about what it's actually costing our country to have all these riots and protests. Now we've seen the numbers that the rioters have caused over $1 billion of damage, but there are some other more intangible costs that I want to talk about today. And one of them has to do with the cost of taking our law enforcement officers away from other things that they were actually meant to do. So take, for example, the U.S. Marshals Service. The Marshal Service was established in 1789. They've got about 4,000 agents around the country, but they're tasked with a whole lot of different things that they have to do, like protecting federal judges, protecting courthouses. They have to do everything from policing the Antarctic station to doing convoy security for the nuclear arsenal in the United States. They also have missing children's units, they have gang units, and all of these things are kind of a zero-sum game. I mean, a guy can only do what one guy can do. So if his job is to protect a courthouse, he can't be doing some of those other things. They've got to task people around the country to do these different jobs. Now, we know that there are about 800,000 children that are reported missing in the United States every year. And the U.S. Marshals actually have a large part to play in trying to find those kids and bring them back to their families. Some of them are have been stolen by a family member, an estranged husband or something like that. Some of them are being trafficked for labor or sex, and many of them are underage, and so that's makes it more important. The bottom line is these guys have their work cut out for them, and they've been doing an amazing job with actually only 3 people on the missing children's unit in Washington, D.C., directing all these different operations around the country. And we just recently saw an operation in Georgia where marshals worked with local law enforcement and were able to find 39 missing children. Now, there's some kind of conspiracy theories out there that this was actually a sex ring or something like that. That's not true. It's not the case. This was not a brothel or something that was selling children. These were mostly kids who had been reported missing that were found by marshals and, again, local law enforcement out of Atlanta. Now, I got a chance to go and talk to the head of the missing children's unit in Washington, D.C., and talk to his name is Agent Floriano. I got to talk to him about what they're doing and the scope and scale of this problem. Check this out.
Floriano Whitwell, Branch Chief of the Sex Offender Investigations Branch within the United States Marshal Service. As of last year, as of 2019, according to the FBI statistics and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, there were about a little over 400,000 missing children in our country. The vast majority of that, I think 92 or 93%, are what we call endangered runaways. And that's about 380,000 children, roughly between the ages of 13 to 17 years old. And that is what we focus on in the Marshal Service, is that segment of missing children. Common scenarios are children that are in some sort of group home, and they are chronic runaways, and they're being trafficked. They're on the internet being trafficked by pimps for sexual solicitation. That's a very common scenario. Other ones are younger children that are being groomed, or we just had a case in Atlanta during this recent operation where we had a 15-year-old who was 3 months pregnant by a 38-year-old who is a convicted sex offender. We see that too often. We see that and really the proliferation of child trafficking for sexual exploitation. Those are the very common scenarios. The operation in Georgia, Operation Not Forgotten, is the first of many operations that we intend to launch in the Marshal Service. We chose Atlanta because that was the first place we'd run a missing child operation, and that was about a year ago, Operation Empty Nest. And those folks there were already familiar with the resources we needed to get in place and how to work these types of cases. And the intent was to run an operation in multiple cities around the same time, but because of COVID and the operational restrictions, some of these operations had to be delayed. Operation Not Forgotten, again, was chosen because of the resources we have there in the Southeast Regional Fugitive Task Force and the experience of those investigators working these cases previously. And what we did was we got with our state and local partners, the Georgia Attorney General's office, our local officers on our task force, some federal partners. So we got with our state and local partners, the Georgia Attorney General's office, and we sat down and we came up with a game plan of what, before we do this operation, what we needed to not only just select our cases, but more importantly, figure out what kind of resources we need once we recover them. Historically, we're cops and we catch bad guys, but we're catching good people now, we're catching kids. What resources do we need to have in place? Because it's not as simple as just turning this child over to somebody. And so we spent a lot of time, a lot of research, a lot of talking with our partners, with Children's Hospital, with DCFS, with social services, to get these resources in place. And that's what we did. We approached this from a holistic perspective, an abundant amount of resources to try to help these kids with whatever issues they're facing or dealing with, make sure they were getting screened for mental health issues or whatever else that we might be able to help facilitate. So this is a huge problem. The hundreds of thousands of missing children are an epidemic. We at the U.S. Marshal Service, and under the director of our director, Donald Washington, who strongly supports this mission, we're trying to have an impact. We're trying to do the best we can with the resources we have in place. I have a missing child unit here that consists of three personnel that manages the program for our agency. But the truth is, the recoveries and the investigations are done by the deputies in the field. In the most recent case of the Southeast Regional Fugitive Task Force's execution of Operation Not Forgotten, they're a fugitive task force that is mandated to work state and local violent fugitives. That's their primary mission. They had to put those tasks to the side for 2 weeks to do this operation and find these missing kids. And we're grateful that they did, but it's a zero-sum game. In order for us to deploy these resources, it detracts from other mission sets that are often equally as important. But again, our leadership is very passionate and supportive of this initiative, and we're trying to throw as many resources as we can to make an impact. But the reality is, we're just scratching the surface. We're very happy about our recoveries, but there's a much larger problem that needs to be addressed, and addressed holistically.
Yeah.
So the truth of the matter is, we're just one step in the process. We want to get these kids because they're missing, and we want to get them hopefully into a better situation. But I agree that we as a society need to look at this large number and start deploying resources and asking questions as to why there are so many missing kids. What are the underlying issues? And it's only then that we can address those and stop these high numbers. Because no matter how many law enforcement resources we throw at this, right, it'll be a continuing problem, a snowballing problem if we don't look at the roots of these problems. Why these kids are missing, why we have so many chronic runaways. My message to the American people would be, we're so focused on different crimes, whether it's the war on drugs or the war on this or the war on that. When I assumed this position as the branch chief of this sex offender investigations branch, my eyes were opened. There's over 430,000 missing kids a year in our country, and of them, at least 65,000 kids are estimated to be sex trafficked. To me, that is completely unacceptable, and our society needs to address this holistically through government, through our citizens, but it needs to be addressed, and everyone's eyes need to be open to this issue.
Now, what he didn't want to tell you is that, again, this is a zero-sum game. So if these guys have to be pulled off of what they're doing to go and guard the courthouse in Portland because it's being attacked by rioters every night, well, then that means they can't be out there looking for lost children. So in this way, these rioters are directly impacting families across the country who are desperately looking for their lost kids. And that's a big deal. And this is something that ought to be much more visible in the news, and it's not. But that's why we talk about it on the Hot Zone. Now, the Trump administration is working to get more assets and more agents into these programs to try to help out. And it's having quite an effect. This is the kind of thing that if a Democratic administration had done this, they would probably get a Nobel Peace Prize. They would be lauded in the press. This would be all over the news. But as it is, you're not seeing a whole lot about it. Last week, Ivanka Trump and Bill Barr announced $100 million in grants from the federal government to try to increase the number of missing kids and exploited kids that are saved through these programs.
Today, I'm happy to announce that the department is awarding over $100 million in grants across the country targeted at human trafficking. And these grants are going to support state, local, and tribal jurisdictions, victim service providers, task forces, and key research initiatives.
It's a calling because we believe it's the greatest form of evil in the world today, because there are 40 million people around the world that need us. They need us to say, no longer is it about the credit, it's about the mission. No longer is it about, well, we're not going to work from Florida to Georgia or from right to left. We're going to all rally together to be able to push back this darkness and push back this evil. And you probably hear from my tone that I'm pretty passionate about it.
We've marshaled all our resources to fight this criminal activity and to do what we can to help the survivors.
With over $100 million being announced today in new grants, it's the administration's largest ever investment in Department of Justice grants to combat the scourge of human trafficking, arguably the gravest of human rights violations.
Now, Chad Wolf is the acting director of Homeland Security, and he recently gave a speech about this and talked about the work that his agents are doing, taking care of these rioters, trying to push back against these rioters in cities across the country, and why it's so important.
Some politicians and media figures have brazenly characterized the extreme violence in Portland and other cities around the country as mostly peaceful. Our Constitution protects the natural right to freedom of speech and peaceful assembly. The Department supports the exercise of everyone's First Amendment rights. There is, however, no constitutional right to loot, to burn, or to assault law enforcement officers or your fellow citizens. Every day, DHS professionals are in that arena while others sit on the sidelines and criticize. They have that right, and DHS law enforcement proudly helps ensure they can exercise that right safely. But make no mistake, there's more work to be done as we see groups right here at home seeking to tear down our government institutions and our way of life. I'm proud to say that DHS has taken unprecedented actions to address all forms of violent extremism, to specifically include threats posed by lone offenders and small cells of individuals. Just this week, we're releasing an implementation plan that outlines dozens of separate actions across the DHS enterprise designed to combat domestic terrorism. and soon we will announce our terrorism prevention grant recipients. Let me be clear. DHS stands in absolute opposition to any form of violent extremism, whether by white supremacist extremists or anarchist extremists. We will continue our daily efforts to combat all forms of domestic terror.
So again, when we talk about these riots and the costs involved, it's not just the cost of replacing all the things that these idiots break. It's not just a cost of insurance going up for millions of people around the country who now are going to have to pay more in insurance because of all the insurance claims from these burnt buildings and things like that. These petulant children who are rioting across the United States do not have the right to burn and to steal and to wreck things because they're angry at Donald Trump. Nobody has the right to do that. You do not have the right to destroy the work of another man's hand. And Chad Wolf just said as much in his speech. And now we're seeing that there's a much bigger cost. That cost has to do with the cost is being paid in the suffering of little children across this country. So remember that when you watch the evening news and you see these quote unquote mostly peaceful protests, and tell your friends. Thanks for watching The Hot Zone. I'm Chuck Holton. We'll see you next time.
The Hot Zone is produced by Amy Holton and Livefire Media. Copyright 2019.